Tell me this is the last secret you'll ever hide from me.
But this one could cost you your child. Then whatever comes next, we face it together.
Anyone who reaches for my family won't leave with their hands mown. Did you ever stop loving me?
I stopped waiting, not loving.
Then give me one last chance.
Korean Mafia
Don't
boss
waste it.
divorces his wife until his mother reveals her secret. He built an empire on trusting no one. She rebuilt it by teaching him how. Now, 6 months into the marriage, everyone said couldn't survive its own secrets. A decades-old promise made before either of them was born is about to test that trust all over again. If you believe every child deserves a life free of inherited wars, hit subscribe now. Like this video if you're already Team Amara and Ji-hoon. Share it with someone who loves a good family secret. Only the traitors, the cowards, and the Baek family's spies would scroll past this one. If you're new here, a quick warning. This family does not do simple. Kang Ji-hoon was one of Seoul's most feared mafia bosses, a man whose silence was more dangerous than most people's screaming, running an empire built on precision, fear, and an unshakable rule that trust was a currency he spent almost never. His wife, Amara Whitmore, was the Black American woman who married into that empire 4 years ago and nearly lost it all when Ji-hoon, convinced she was hiding an affair, handed her divorce papers under a hotel chandelier that had clearly seen better decisions. The truth, when it finally surfaced, was worse and far more heartbreaking than any affair. Amara hadn't been betraying him. She'd been protecting him, secretly negotiating for 2 years with a man named Yoon Ha-rin to bury a blood debt Ji-hoon's late father had written decades earlier, a debt that promised his life or his marriage to a rival family the moment he turned 30. What nobody expected was the twist buried underneath that twist. Ha-rin wasn't just an old enemy's son collecting an inheritance of hatred. He was Ji-hoon's own uncle. The secret son, Madam Han, had been forced to give up before her marriage, raised to believe his mother had chosen an empire over him. It took a wooden box, a sprint through Incheon Airport, and 30 years of buried family shame finally cracking open before this family chose honesty over silence. Ji-hoon stopped Amara's flight. His mother finally told the truth, and the Kang family welcomed a long-lost son home instead of burying him in another war. 3 months later, Ji-hoon and Amara remarried in white instead of black, and for 6 months, life did something this family had never once been good at. It calmed down, which, if you know anything about families like this one, should have been everyone's first warning sign. Amara sat on the edge of the bathtub in the master suite of the Kang estate at midnight, staring at a pregnancy test like it might renegotiate its answer if she glared hard enough. 2 pink lines, unmistakable, terrifying in a specific way. Good news becomes terrifying when you've learned, the hard way, that nothing in this family arrives without complications attached like an unwanted party guest. She should tell him immediately. She knew that with the clarity of a woman who had already lived through what happens when she doesn't. 2 years of secrets had nearly cost her a marriage and very nearly gotten her husband killed. She had promised herself, standing in an airport at 4 in the morning with a boarding pass in her hand, that she was done carrying things alone. And yet, 3 nights earlier, unable to sleep, she'd gone digging through old family records out of idle curiosity, the kind of late-night research spiral people fall into when their brains refuse to cooperate with something as simple as rest. What she found instead of comfort was a name she didn't recognize, attached to a document she absolutely did not expect. Her great-grandmother, Adaeze, a woman family legend remembered only as having traveled a lot in her youth, had apparently traveled directly into the middle of a Korean clan dispute generations ago, close enough to leave a signature on a contract nobody in Amara's family had mentioned in 81 years. The Baek family. A name that meant nothing to Amara, and judging by the way Madam Han's face had gone the color of old paper when Amara mentioned it in passing over breakfast, meant everything to everyone else in this house. Where did you hear that name? Madame Han had asked, setting down her tea with the deliberate care of a woman handling something explosive. A family record. Why? Should I not have? Madame Han hadn't answered directly, which in the Kang household was its own kind of answer, the sort that made Amara's stomach drop 3 separate times before she'd even finished her toast. Now, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with a positive test in one hand and a half-formed dread she couldn't fully name in the other, Amara understood, with the sinking clarity of a woman who has learned to read a room even when nobody's speaking, that these two facts were about to collide in a way she was nowhere near prepared for. She found Ji-hoon in his study an hour later, 3 phone calls deep into shipment logistics that suddenly felt very small compared to what she was about to say. He looked up, took one glance at her face, and set the phone down without finishing his sentence, a habit he'd developed in the last 6 months that Amara had come to recognize as his version of, I am listening, actually listening, not performing it. You look like you're about to tell me something that's going to ruin my week, he said, not unkindly, more like a man who'd learned to brace himself with humor instead of dread. I'm pregnant, Amara said, because there was no elegant way to lead into that sentence, and honestly, after everything they'd survived, elegant felt overrated. For one full second, Ji-hoon's face did something Amara had genuinely never seen it do. It simply opened, all the careful control and calculated stillness falling away into something raw and unguarded, and, for a terrifying, wonderful moment, entirely undefended. Then she said the second part. And I think it might have something to do with a decades-old contract between your family and someone called the Baek family. The openness on Ji-hoon's face didn't disappear exactly. It just hardened fast, the way water freezes when the temperature drops without warning, old instincts reasserting themselves before joy had even finished arriving. Say that again, he said quietly. Slowly. Somewhere down the hall, though neither of them could have known it yet, a member of the household staff who had served the family faithfully for 3 years was already lifting a phone to their ear, dialing a number memorized months ago, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Congratulations, the staff member said softly, once the call connected. It's confirmed. She's pregnant. Send word to the Baek family. Tell them their claim just became very real. Ji-hoon did not raise his voice. He never had to. But the specific silence that followed Amara's words, the one where he simply stood, walked to the window and stared out at the Kang estate's grounds like he was recalculating every variable in his life at once, was somehow louder than shouting. Start from the beginning, he said finally, without turning around. All of it. Don't protect me from any part of this. Amara almost smiled, despite everything, because 6 months ago, he wouldn't have said that. 6 months ago, he would have assumed the worst and built an entire case against her out of half a sentence. Growth, apparently, looked like a man learning to ask instead of accuse, even when the news genuinely was as complicated as it sounded. She told him everything. The late-night research spiral. The name Adaeze. A great-grandmother nobody in her family had ever fully explained beyond vague, romantic stories about a woman who'd traveled a lot in her youth and come home different, quieter, carrying secrets she apparently took to her grave, along with whatever she'd left behind in Seoul. The contract, old and formal in the specific way, documents get when the people who wrote them assumed nobody would ever actually need to read them again. A clause binding any child born of Adaeze's bloodline and a ranking member of specific rival clans to an automatic claim on disputed territory. Territory, Ji-hoon repeated slowly, turning to face her. What territory? I don't know the details. Your mother went white as a sheet when I mentioned the Baek name, and then she suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. Amara crossed her arms, less out of defensiveness now, and more out of the specific exhaustion of a woman who had hoped, just once, for uncomplicated good news. I was going to ask her properly today. I promise you, Ji-hoon, I wasn't hiding this the way I hid things before. I found out myself 3 days ago, and I was still trying to understand what I was looking at. I believe you, Ji-hoon said, and the immediacy of it, no hesitation, no interrogation, landed somewhere in Amara's chest like relief, finally exhaling after holding its breath for years. That's not what worries me. What worries me is that my mother recognized that name instantly, and my mother does not forget old debts. She catalogs them. He was already moving toward the door, phone in hand, the calm efficiency of a man who solved problems for a living, replacing the brief, undefended joy from moments earlier. Amara caught his arm before he could leave. Ji-hoon. He stopped. Before we go find your mother and turn this into a full family interrogation, she said, can we just have 30 seconds? Just us. Because in about 2 minutes, this is going to become a security briefing, and I'd like to remember at least a little bit of today, as the day we found out we're having a baby. Not just the day we found out that baby comes with a lawsuit attached. Something in Ji-hoon's face softened, the calculation briefly giving way again to the man underneath all of it. The one who'd sprinted through an airport for her, the one who'd stood in front of his own mother and demanded honesty instead of another generation of silence. He crossed the space between them and put his hand gently against her still flat stomach, an oddly formal gesture for a man capable of ordering entire warehouses moved without blinking. A baby, he said, testing the word like it might combust. We're having a baby. We are, Amara said. Try to look slightly less terrified about it. I am not terrified, Ji-hoon said, in the exact tone of a man who was extremely terrified. I am simply recalculating my entire 5-year security plan. That's terrified with extra steps. For one small, stolen moment, they simply stood there, foreheads nearly touching, the weight of an ancient contract and a mysterious enemy briefly forgotten in favor of the much simpler, much more overwhelming fact that they were going to be parents. It didn't last long. Nothing peaceful in this family ever did. Madame Han found them first, moving through the study door with none of her usual composed grace, her face carrying an expression Ji-hoon had seen exactly twice before in his life, both times immediately preceding disaster. You told her, she said to Ji-hoon, not a question. Then, to Amara, more gently than either of them expected, you should not have gone looking through those records alone, child. Some doors in this family were locked for good reason. Then unlock this one, Ji-hoon said. Now, before whatever reason you had for hiding it becomes the reason we lose something we can't get back. Madame Han closed the study door behind her, the click of the lock unusually loud in the sudden quiet. Sit down, she said. Both of you. This is going to take longer than you'd like, and you are both going to be very unhappy with how far back it goes. Outside the estate walls, in a quiet apartment across the city, a woman studied a photograph of Amara from the wedding 6 months earlier, tracing the outline of her face with something between admiration and calculation. Beside her, a phone buzzed with a single incoming message from the household staff member inside the Kang estate. Confirmed. Baek family notified. They're already moving. The woman smiled, set the photograph down, and reached for her coat. Madame Han settled into the chair across from her son and daughter-in-law with the particular stiffness of a woman preparing to hand over a grenade she'd been quietly diffusing for decades. Outside the study window, the estate's gardens looked deceptively peaceful, koi drifting in slow circles, entirely unbothered by the fact that a second family war was apparently assembling itself somewhere beyond the gates. Before your father and I married, she began, our 2 families were already entangled with several others through old business alliances, the kind that used marriage and inheritance instead of contracts, because apparently our ancestors found paperwork insufficiently binding when blood would do. She paused, choosing her words with visible care. One of those families was the Baeks. They controlled shipping routes through the southern coast, powerful, ambitious, and paranoid about losing ground to rising organizations like ours. To secure peace between our families, an agreement was drafted generations ago, one that predates your grandfather, tying any future heir born of specific bloodlines to a binding claim on contested territory. And Adaeze, Amara said. Where does she fit into an agreement between two Korean crime families? Madame Han's expression flickered, something almost like reluctant respect crossing it. Your great-grandmother was not simply a woman who traveled a lot in her youth, as your family apparently prefers to remember her. She was a diplomat's daughter, sent to Seoul as part of an international trade delegation in the years after the war, when Korea was rebuilding alliances wherever it could find them. She caught the attention of a Baek son, a romance nobody on either side approved of, and when it produced a child, the Baek family, terrified of scandal and desperate to salvage the alliance's usefulness, wrote her bloodline directly into their inheritance clauses instead of simply disowning the child the way pride usually demanded. So they didn't erase her, Ji-hoon said slowly. They weaponized her. They made her descendants an asset, Madame Han said. A quiet, dormant one, buried in paperwork nobody expected to matter again, because everyone assumed that particular bloodline had scattered too far to ever intersect with the families it was tied to. Her gaze moved to Amara, something almost apologetic in it. Nobody could have predicted a descendant of that same bloodline would one day walk into this specific family's life, fall in love with this specific man, and revive a clause everyone had long since filed under harmless history. Harmless, Ji-hoon repeated, with the flat, dangerous calm Amara had learned meant he was furious and simply choosing not to perform it. You knew this clause existed. I knew it existed the way one knows an old scar exists, Madame Han said. I did not think it would ever open again. When did you find out about Amara's connection to it? Madame Han hesitated, and that hesitation, brief as it was, told Amara everything before the actual words arrived. 3 days ago, Madame Han admitted. When Amara mentioned the name Adaeze over breakfast, I recognized it immediately because I had seen it once before, years ago, buried in the original contract during a routine review of old family documents. I told myself it was an old coincidence not worth alarming anyone over. I was wrong, and I should have told you both the moment the name left her mouth instead of leaving the estate to think. You're doing it again, Ji-hoon said quietly, choosing silence and calling it caution. Madame Han did not argue. To her credit, she simply absorbed the accusation the way a woman does when she knows it's earned. You are right. Old habits apparently take longer to unlearn than I would like to admit, which is why I am telling you everything now, immediately, before the Baek family finishes deciding how loudly they intend to announce their intentions. How would they even know Amara is pregnant? Amara asked. We only found out ourselves this morning. Madame Han's face went carefully blank, the specific blankness of a woman who had already begun suspecting something she didn't want to say out loud. That, she said, is the part that worries me most. A pregnancy test result reaching a rival family within hours means one thing. Someone inside this house is not simply loyal to us on paper. The three of them sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over the room like something physical. Who has access to the medical deliveries? Ji-hoon asked finally, his voice gone flat and clinical, the tone Amara recognized from every story she'd heard about the man he'd been before their marriage started teaching him softer registers. Who would have known before we did? Several staff members, Madame Han said. Household security, the physician's assistant who confirmed the results. I will have every one of them investigated by tonight. Across the city, in the quiet apartment overlooking a much less glamorous stretch of Seoul, the woman who had spent the morning studying Amara's wedding photograph finished buttoning her coat and checked her reflection one final time. Her name, had anyone in the Kang household bothered to ask, was Baek Soo-jin, granddaughter of the family patriarch who had drafted that decades-old clause, and she had spent the last 3 years working her way patiently into a position close enough to the Kang estate to be useful the moment an opportunity like this one finally arrived. She dialed a number and waited exactly 2 rings before it connected. It's confirmed, she said. The child exists. Now we make our move before the Kang family finishes deciding how to protect it. On the other end of the line, a voice colder than Ji-hoon's on his worst day replied, without hesitation, Then let's remind them exactly what they owe us. By nightfall, the Kang estate had transformed into something resembling a quiet, well-dressed crime scene. Security personnel moved through hallways with the clipped efficiency of people who understood that somewhere among the staff they greeted every morning was a person who had sold information valuable enough to summon a rival family back from 30 years of dormancy. Ji-hoon sat in his study reviewing personnel files with the same focus he once reserved for shipment manifests, except now every name carried the weight of a potential betrayal instead of a logistics problem. Amara sat across from him, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, watching her husband work through the list with a patience that would have been impossible for him a year earlier. "The physician's assistant checks out," Ji-hoon said, sliding one folder aside. 5 years of service, family still in the city, nothing suspicious in her financials. He opened the next folder and went very still. "What is it?" "Household staff member. Hired 3 years ago. Excellent references. Spotless record." Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. Except her references were verified by a firm that, according to my head of security, doesn't actually exist. Someone built her an entire employment history from nothing. Who is she? Ji-hoon turned the folder around so Amara could see the photograph clipped to the front page. A woman in her late 20s with a carefully neutral expression, the kind of face designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away from it. "Her name," Ji-hoon said, "is listed as Han Eugene. I'd stake my life the name is fabricated the same way the references are." Before either of them could say more, Madame Han appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the specific grimness of someone who'd just confirmed something she'd hoped to be wrong about. Security found her 10 minutes ago, attempting to leave through the service entrance with a bag already packed. She didn't resist. She simply smiled, like she'd been expecting this exact outcome for weeks. They found her in the estate security office, seated calmly across from two of Ji-hoon's most intimidating enforcers, looking about as concerned as a woman waiting for a bus that was running slightly late. "You're not going to get anything out of me through threats," she said, before Ji-hoon had even fully entered the room. "I've already done what I was sent to do. Threatening me now is just theater." "Who sent you?" Ji-hoon said. "You already know," the woman said. "You've known since your wife mentioned that name over breakfast 3 days ago. The Baek family has been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. I simply made sure they didn't have to wait any longer than necessary." "Why?" Amara asked quietly. "What do they actually want with a child who hasn't even been born yet?" The woman's expression flickered, something almost like sympathy crossing it before disappearing back into careful blankness. "You should ask them yourself. They've requested a meeting. Formal, public enough to guarantee everyone's safety, private enough to avoid embarrassing anyone unnecessarily. 3 days from now, at the old shipping registry building downtown, the same place the original agreement was signed decades ago." She smiled thinly. "They're sentimental about locations, if nothing else. And if we refuse," Ji-hoon said, "then they'll simply explain their position to every rival organization in Seoul, instead of to you directly," the woman said. "And trust me, once people learn the Kang family produced an heir to disputed Baek territory and tried to hide it instead of negotiating properly, you'll have considerably more enemies than the ones currently asking politely for a meeting." Madame Han's face had gone pale during the exchange, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its usual authority. "There's something else you should know before you decide anything," she said, looking at Ji-hoon and Amara both. "Something I should have told you the moment Amara mentioned that name, and something considerably more complicated than a territorial claim." "What?" Ji-hoon said, dread already creeping into his voice. "The current head of the Baek family," Madame Han said slowly. "The man who just sent this woman to infiltrate our household and confirm Amara's pregnancy is someone I once considered marrying before your father. A man I loved, briefly, before politics decided otherwise. He has spent 30 years believing I chose ambition over him, in almost exactly the same way Ha-rin once believed I chose an empire over him." She closed her eyes briefly, the weight of decades of buried history settling visibly over her shoulders. This isn't simply about territory, Ji-hoon. I fear this is about an old wound that never healed, and a man who has waited a very long time for a reason to make this family understand exactly what losing someone you love actually feels like. The room went silent, except for the quiet hum of security monitors along the wall. How many old wounds does this family have buried? Amara asked finally, half exhausted, half disbelieving, that keep turning into active wars 6 months apart? Apparently, Madame Han said, with the particular dry honesty of a woman who had run out of patience for pretending otherwise, considerably more than I ever accounted for. Ji-hoon looked at his wife, then at his mother, then back at the woman still sitting calmly in the security office, like she'd already won something none of them fully understood yet. "Tell the Baek family we'll be there," he said. "But this time, we're not walking into that meeting blind, the way this family has walked into every other disaster for 30 years. We're walking in with the full truth already in hand." "And if the truth isn't enough this time?" Amara asked quietly. Ji-hoon's expression hardened into something that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the man who had once slid divorce papers across a table without a single word of explanation. "Then we make sure they understand exactly what happens to people who threaten what's mine." The old shipping registry building hadn't been used for actual shipping business in over 2 decades, but it had clearly been maintained with the specific reverence people reserve for places where history refuses to stay buried. Marble floors, high-arched windows, and the faint, particular smell of old paper and older grudges greeted Ji-hoon and Amara as they stepped inside 3 days later, flanked by enough quiet, watchful security that the building's original architects would have been alarmed by the modern security cameras hidden discreetly among the ornate crown molding. Baek Jin-woo was waiting for them in what had once been the registry's main office, seated behind a desk clearly chosen for its symbolic weight rather than practical function. He was older than Ji-hoon expected, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent 30 years perfecting patience as a weapon. Beside him stood the woman from the Kang household security office, Baek Soo-jin, no longer bothering with the neutral, forgettable expression she'd worn as staff. "Kang Ji-hoon," Jin-woo said, not rising, "and the famous Amara Whitmore. I've heard a great deal about you both. Some of it was even true." "Let's skip the pleasantries," Ji-hoon said. "You sent someone to infiltrate my household, confirm my wife's pregnancy, and threaten my family's stability over a claim written before either of us existed. I'd like to understand exactly what you think you're owed." Jin-woo's expression didn't shift, though something flickered behind his eyes at the word owed. "Territory," he said simply. "The southern shipping routes your family absorbed after a war your father started and mine lost. The clause exists specifically to correct that imbalance, should the bloodlines ever intersect again. I did not write this rule. I am simply the one patient enough to still be alive when it finally became relevant." "And that's all this is," Amara said. "Business." Something in Jin-woo's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Amara to catch it. "No," he admitted, quieter now. "It is not all this is." Madame Han, who had insisted on accompanying them despite Ji-hoon's objections, stepped forward from where she'd been standing silently near the door. "Hello, Jin-woo," she said, and her voice carried none of its usual command, just something old and tired, and finally, after 30 years, willing to be honest. "You look well. You look like a woman who chose an empire over the man who actually loved her," Jin-woo said, and the bitterness in it, 30 years old and apparently no less sharp for the aging, filled the entire room like smoke. "I did not choose the empire," Madame Han said. "It was chosen for me, the same way everything in this world gets chosen for people who never actually get a vote. I loved you, Jin-woo. I have never once denied that, not even to myself in 30 years of quiet regret. But my father would have destroyed us both rather than let that love survive, and I was young enough and frightened enough to believe that surviving mattered more than fighting for something I'd already been told I couldn't keep." "You could have told me," Jin-woo said. "Instead, I spent 30 years believing you simply preferred power to me." "I know," Madame Han said, "and I am sorry. Truly, finally, without excuse. I have spent this last year learning, very slowly and very painfully, that silence dressed up as protection is still just cowardice with better manners. I should have told you the truth 30 years ago, the same way I should have told my son the truth about Ha-rin before it nearly cost him everything. Jinwoo's jaw tightened at the mention of Ha-rin's name. Your other secret son. My other regret, Madame Han corrected quietly. One I am still trying to repair. I would like the chance to repair this one too, Jinwoo, if you'll let me, instead of using an innocent, unborn child to punish me for a decision that was never truly mine to make. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Ji-hoon watched his mother, a woman he had spent his entire life believing was made of nothing but calculation and control, stand in front of an old love with nothing left to hide behind, and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much courage that particular kind of honesty actually required. The territory claim is real, Jinwoo said finally, addressing Ji-hoon directly. Legally binding, recognized by every organization that matters in this city. I could enforce it tomorrow, and no one would question my right to do so. But, Amara said, Jinwoo's eyes moved to her, something almost curious in his expression. But I find myself considerably less interested in punishing a child for the mistakes of its grandparents than I was an hour ago. He looked back at Madame Han. You will not simply apologize and expect 30 years to dissolve, Hana. But perhaps we can discuss a different resolution than the one my granddaughter was instructed to prepare for. What resolution? Ji-hoon asked carefully, old instincts refusing to relax, simply because the tone in the room had shifted. A partnership, Jinwoo said. Not a claim on territory, but a genuine alliance between our families. One built on the truth this time, instead of contracts drafted by frightened old men trying to control lives they had no right to control. Your child could grow up as a bridge between two families instead of a prize to be fought over. Amara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in 3 days. And if we agree, then the Baek family withdraws its claim entirely, Jinwoo said, in exchange for a formal alliance, negotiated properly, publicly, with nothing hidden and nothing buried in old boxes for future generations to stumble over. Ji-hoon looked at his mother, then at his wife, then finally at the old man who had loved her before any of them existed. We'll need time to discuss terms. Of course, Jinwoo said, then quieter, almost gentle. But Ji-hoon, do not make my mistake. Do not let pride or fear keep you silent with the people you love. It costs considerably more than any territory ever could. As they left the registry building, Amara slipped her hand into Ji-hoon's, the tension of the last 3 days beginning, finally, to ease. That went better than I expected, she said. Don't relax yet, Ji-hoon said quietly, glancing at Baek Soo-jin, who watched them leave with an expression that suggested she had not yet decided whether her grandfather's newfound sentimentality was a resolution or a betrayal of everything she'd spent 3 years working toward. Not everyone in that room agreed with how this ended. Baek Soo-jin waited exactly 2 days before making her disagreement known, which, considering the amount of patience the rest of her family seemed to specialize in, Ji-hoon privately considered almost impulsive by comparison. The message arrived not through official channels, but through a photograph, delivered anonymously to 3 separate rival organizations across Seoul, showing Amara leaving a prenatal appointment with a caption that required no further explanation. The Kang heir carries a claim on Baek territory. Draw your own conclusions about how prepared this family really is to defend what's theirs. She's trying to force her grandfather's hand, Madame Han said, studying the image on Ji-hoon's phone with the particular fury of a woman watching someone undo careful diplomatic work out of spite. If enough rival families believe there's an unresolved territorial claim sitting inside our family, they'll start circling regardless of what Jinwoo actually intends to do about it. She wants a war, her grandfather already decided against, Ji-hoon said, pacing the length of his study while Amara sat with one hand resting protectively over her stomach, watching him with the specific calm of a woman who had learned, the hard way, that panicking alongside him rarely helped either of them think clearly. 3 years of infiltrating our household, building an entire fake identity, waiting for exactly this moment, and her grandfather chooses reconciliation instead. That's not a woman who's simply going to accept the alliance quietly. Then we need to speak to her directly, Amara said, before this spirals into something even Jinwoo can't contain. They found her that evening at a small restaurant near the harbor, chosen deliberately by Soo-jin as public enough to guarantee her own safety and private enough to avoid an audience for whatever confrontation she was clearly expecting. She sat alone at a corner table, composed, unbothered, exactly as she'd been in the security office days earlier. I wondered how long it would take, she said, as Ji-hoon and Amara sat across from her. Grandfather's gone soft in his old age. 30 years of patient planning, and one conversation with his old lover undoes all of it. He didn't go soft, Amara said. He chose peace over revenge. That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, Soo-jin said, and for the first time, real emotion cracked through her careful composure, something raw and long buried finally surfacing. I grew up hearing about the Kang family the way other children hear ghost stories. The family who stole our territory, who left my grandfather brokenhearted, who built an empire on the ashes of everything the Baek name used to mean. I spent 3 years working toward a single purpose, correcting an imbalance that's existed since before I was born, and now I'm supposed to simply accept a handshake and a partnership agreement instead. Your grandfather is the one who decided that, Ji-hoon said carefully. Not us. My grandfather, Soo-jin said, her voice tightening, is choosing to trust the same family that broke his heart 30 years ago, based on nothing but sentiment and a pregnant woman's sad eyes. Forgive me if I don't share his newfound optimism. What do you actually want? Amara asked quietly. Not the territory, not the old grudge. What do you, personally, actually want out of any of this? Soo-jin's composure finally, fully cracked. I wanted to matter, she said, quieter now, the anger draining into something far more exhausted underneath. I spent 3 years building a life inside your household, learning your routines, earning your trust. Also, I could finally give my family back something we lost decades ago. And now that opportunity is just going to be negotiated away in a conference room somewhere, and I'll go back to being the granddaughter who spent 3 years on a mission that ended in a handshake instead of a victory. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Amara studied the young woman across from her, recognizing something uncomfortably familiar in her expression. The particular loneliness of someone who had spent years carrying a burden alone because she believed, wrongly, that the weight of it was the only thing that made her useful. I understand that feeling better than you'd think, Amara said finally. I spent 2 years carrying a secret alone because I thought protecting someone meant doing it silently, without help, without anyone else's involvement. It nearly cost me my marriage. It nearly cost Ji-hoon his life. The only reason any of us survived it is because eventually, someone finally chose honesty over pride. She leaned forward slightly. Your grandfather isn't abandoning your family's legacy, Soo-jin. He's choosing to build a different one that doesn't require anyone's grandchild to spend 3 years pretending to be someone else just to matter. Soo-jin's jaw tightened, old anger warring visibly with something that looked, for the first time, like genuine consideration. And if I don't agree with his decision, then you'll have to decide, Ji-hoon said, whether you're fighting for your family's honor or simply fighting because you don't know how to stop. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Amara began to wonder if they'd get anywhere at all tonight. Then Soo-jin's shoulders, held rigid for the entire conversation, finally lowered, just slightly. I need time, she said. This isn't a decision I can undo in one dinner. Take it, Ji-hoon said. But Soo-jin, if you release another photograph, another anonymous message designed to provoke a war your own grandfather has already chosen against, you won't just be fighting us, you'll be fighting him too. Soo-jin's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Noted, she said, and left without another word. Outside the restaurant, Amara exhaled slowly, one hand still resting over her stomach. Do you think she'll listen? I don't know, Ji-hoon admitted, but for the first time, I think she actually heard us instead of just waiting for us to leave so she could keep planning. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at the Kang estate, bearing the Baek family seal. Inside was a single-signed document, formally withdrawing the territorial claim, and a short, handwritten note from Jin-woo. My granddaughter needed convincing. It seems your wife succeeded where 30 years of my own patience could not. The alliance stands. Perhaps this family and yours can finally stop inheriting each other's wars. 7 months later, the Kang estate hosted its second ceremony of the year, though this one had nothing to do with weddings or reconciliations between old lovers. It was, according to the physician who delivered the news with visible relief, that nothing in this particular pregnancy had gone as dramatically as the family's history suggested it might. A healthy baby girl, born just past midnight on a night quiet enough that even Ji-hoon's security detail seemed faintly suspicious of the silence. Amara held her daughter for the first time with the specific disbelief of a woman who had spent 9 months bracing for catastrophe and instead simply got to be a mother. Ji-hoon stood beside the bed, and for the second time in this family's recent history, his carefully maintained composure simply dissolved. No calculation, no old instincts reasserting themselves. Just a man staring at his daughter, like she'd personally rearranged his entire understanding of what mattered in the world. She has your eyes, Amara said softly. She has your stubbornness, Ji-hoon said. I could tell the moment she refused to come out on the schedule the doctor gave us. They named her Adaeze, after the great-grandmother whose buried history had nearly ignited a war before becoming. Instead, the reason 2 families finally chose peace over 3 generations of inherited grudges. Madame Han, when told the name, had gone uncharacteristically quiet for a long moment before simply nodding. Something like genuine peace settling over features that had spent most of the last year carrying the weight of decades of secrets. The formal alliance between the Kang and Baek families was signed publicly 2 weeks later in the same shipping registry building where the original agreement had been drafted generations earlier, except this time the terms were negotiated in daylight, with lawyers from both sides and absolutely no hidden clauses waiting to resurface in another 30 years. Jin-woo attended personally, standing beside Madame Han with the careful, cautious warmth of 2 people rebuilding something neither of them had expected to get a second chance at. Baek Soo-jin was there too, though considerably more subdued than her earlier appearances, standing slightly apart from the ceremony, with the expression of someone still working out how she felt about an ending she hadn't originally wanted. Amara found her near the harbor windows during the reception that followed, Adaeze asleep against her shoulder. I wasn't sure you'd come, Amara said. My grandfather insisted, Soo-jin said. Then, after a pause, quieter, and I wanted to see her. The reason all of this ended in a partnership instead of a war. Amara adjusted her daughter slightly, letting Soo-jin get a better look. She doesn't know yet how much almost happened because of her. I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible. Soo-jin studied the sleeping child for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her expression. I spent 3 years believing the only way to matter was to win something my family lost decades ago. My grandfather sent me an envelope last week after everything was finalized. Said he wanted me to help lead the new partnership between our families instead of continuing to fight a war he'd already ended. And I said yes, Soo-jin admitted, something almost like relief in it. It turns out building something is considerably harder than tearing it down, but I think I prefer the difficulty. Welcome to the family business then, Amara said. Fair warning, it comes with more chandeliers than you'd expect, and significantly more emotional confrontations per calendar year than any reasonable person should have to survive. For the first time since Amara had met her, Sujin actually laughed, real and unguarded. I noticed. Later that evening, once the reception had wound down and most of the guests had departed into the warm night air, Ji-hoon found his mother standing alone near the same koi pond that had witnessed nearly every significant confession this family had ever produced. Jin-woo had left an hour earlier, though the careful, deliberate way Madame Han watched the water suggested her thoughts hadn't gone far from him. "You look happy," Ji-hoon said, settling beside her. "I look like a woman who spent 30 years assuming happiness was a luxury reserved for people braver than me," Madame Han said. "Jin-woo asked me to dinner next week. Nothing formal, just dinner, between two people who apparently still have 30 years of conversations to catch up on. Are you going to go?" "I am considering it," Madame Han said, which, from a woman who had spent her entire life avoiding vulnerability like it was a tactical weakness, Ji-hoon understood to mean yes, absolutely, and terrified about it in equal measure. He looked out at the water, thinking of everything this family had survived in the space of a single year. A marriage nearly destroyed by silence, a brother discovered instead of buried, a territorial war averted by honesty instead of bloodshed, a daughter born into a peace her own existence had very nearly shattered before securing it instead. "We keep almost losing everything," he said, "because someone in this family decides silence is safer than the truth. And then we keep surviving it, because eventually, someone finally chooses honesty instead." "That," Madame Han said, "might be the only inheritance worth passing down to your daughter. Not territory, not an empire built on fear, just the stubborn, difficult habit of telling the truth before it costs you everything." Inside the estate, Amara stood at the nursery window with Adaeze finally settled into her crib, watching Ji-hoon and his mother through the glass, two people who had spent a lifetime mistaking silence for strength, finally learning, slowly and imperfectly, a better way to love the people in front of them. She thought of the wooden box that had started all of this months before her daughter was even conceived, of the letters, the photographs, the debts written in dead men's handwriting that had nearly cost this family everything twice over, of Ha-rin finally welcomed home instead of hunted, of Sujin choosing to build instead of destroy, of Madame Han finally brave enough to reach for a second chance she'd spent 30 years convincing herself she didn't deserve. Every war this family had inherited had one thing in common. It had grown in the dark, in silence, in secrets kept out of fear or pride, or the mistaken belief that protecting someone meant carrying the weight alone. And every single time, the only thing that had ever actually saved them was the terrifying, difficult choice to finally say the truth out loud. Ji-hoon found her there 20 minutes later, slipping his arms around her from behind as they both watched their daughter sleep. "Second Empire," he said quietly, "successfully avoided." "For now," Amara said, leaning back into him. "Knock on wood. This family has a track record. Then we'll face whatever comes next the same way we survived this one," Ji-hoon said. "Together. Honestly. No more locked boxes." Outside, the koi pond settled into stillness, and for the first time in generations, the Kang family's future felt less like a debt waiting to be collected, and more like a home finally worth defending with nothing left to hide.